August 7th, 1944. Dawn crept over the hills of Normandy, a soft gray light stretching across hedgerows and fields where summer wheat swayed like muted gold beneath a shroud of mist. The land itself seemed to hush, as though holding its breath for what was about to unfold. In that stillness, the sound of engines broke the silence, low, guttural growls that carried menace through the morning haze. German Panthers, hulking shapes of steel, moved forward with confidence, their crews certain they would crush whatever resistance lay ahead. These machines were supposed to be unstoppable, the very embodiment of Hitler's promise to turn the tide. For the Americans dug into those hedgerows, it felt like being hunted by giants. Their Shermans, 5 in all, scattered and hidden along the approach to Mortain, were not machines of myth but practical tools, chipped, worn, and stubbornly reliable. Their crews knew the reputation of the Panther all too well. Heavier armor, longer gun, an aura of invincibility that Allied tankers had learned to fear. Yet there they sat, waiting, breathing in the diesel stink of their own machines, the tension hanging as heavy as the morning fog. Private First Class William Keller, barely 21, presses back against the inside of his Sherman, eyes flicking nervously at the periscope. He had grown up on a farm in Ohio, where mornings meant the quiet clank of milk pails and the steady rhythm of work. Now the morning sound was a grinding churn of German treads. He wiped sweat from his hands, though the air was cool. Sweat bore not a heat, but the knowledge that in a few minutes everything would be decided by the first exchange of fire. Beside him, Sergeant James Holloway leaned over the gun controls, his face set like carved stone. He was older, nearing 30, and his men trusted the weight in his voice. Holloway didn't waste words. He spoke once before dawn. "They'll come fast, boys. Let 'em. When they show their sides, we strike." That was it. Orders simple enough to cling to in the chaos ahead. Outside, the fog thickened, swirling to the hedgerows, masking sight lines but carrying sound with clarity. The Germans moved in tight columns, their officers certain that overwhelming firepower would make short work of this defense. After all, wasn't it always so? Panthers against Shermans was no contest, at least on paper. But war does not play out on paper, and Normandy was a battlefield that punished arrogance. The men of the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion knew it. They had fought here for weeks, losing friends to ambushes and artillery, to sudden strikes from hedgerows that seemed alive with hidden fire. They had learned to use the land like a weapon, to make every hedge and every rise of ground work for them. Holloway's Shermans were not symbols of raw power, but of cunning and grit. As the first Panthers loomed into view, their outlines ghostly in the mist, Keller's breath caught. Through the periscope, the German tanks seemed larger than life, like iron beasts pushing against the earth itself. He thought of the posters that had once called the Sherman a workhorse, and nearly laughed, though the sound caught in his throat. Against these Panthers, they looked like tin cans, waiting to be crushed. Yet the workhorse had carried him this far, and he clung to that thought. The German advance was steady, methodical. A commander stood half exposed in his turret, scanning the ground ahead, unaware that American eyes were on him. The rumble of engines, the creak of steel, and the sharp metallic squeal of treads filled the air. Each sound drew the Panthers closer to the hidden Shermans crouched like hunters in the brush. Inside the American tank, silence reigned. The men spoke only with short nods, hands steadying on controls, on the cold metal of shells stacked nearby. Keller's stomach churned with dread, yet his hands obeyed the routine drilled into him. There were 5 men in a steel box, but at that moment they became one machine, bound to the fate of their tank. The clash, when it came, was sudden. A Panther edged forward, its turret sweeping to cover the road. Holloway gave a sharp command, and the Sherman's gun thundered. The recoil shook the crew, the sound deafening within the armored hull. Keller's eyes snapped to the periscope just in time to see the German tank lurch, smoke belching from its side before flames licked skyward. One shot, one Panther gutted. The men didn't cheer. They knew what was coming now. Confusion rippled to the German line. Panthers halted, turrets swiveling to locate the threat. Another Sherman fired, striking home, and another enemy tank blossomed into fire. The Americans had revealed themselves, and the price would be swift. Armor-piercing shells screamed back, striking hedgerows, tearing earth apart. One shot clanged off Holloway's Sherman, rattling the crew to their bones. They waited for the kill strike, but none came. In that narrow lane, the Germans found themselves trapped by the very terrain they thought to dominate. The hedgerows hemmed them in, forcing them to bunch together, exposing their flanks to the Shermans concealed like wolves waiting for prey. Each shot was a gamble. Each second survived a gift. Yet the impossible was happening. 5 Shermans holding back the iron pride of Germany. Through the chaos, character revealed itself. Holloway's calm in issuing orders, Keller's steady hands despite his fear, the loader's frantic but precise rhythm. It all fused into something larger than the sum of its parts. They were not nameless cogs in a war machine, but individuals, each shaping the outcome of this desperate hour. And beyond the hedgerows, the war itself hung in balance. Hitler had staked this counterattack on breaking the Allies at Mortain. If the Panthers broke through, they could cut off the advance, perhaps even shift momentum back in Germany's favor. Yet here, on a misty morning, 5 Shermans had lit the fields with burning steel, rewriting expectations in fire and smoke. When the first wave faltered, a silence fell as brief as it was strange. The Germans, shocked, pulled back to regroup, the wrecks of their vaunted tanks smoldering in the mist. Keller leaned against the metal wall of his Sherman, heart pounding, ears still ringing from the gunfire. He glanced at Holloway, whose face betrayed nothing but a curt nod. They had survived the first exchange. That was enough, for now. The sun began to cut through the fog, shafts of light falling across fields scarred by fire. Black smoke twisted upward, marking the graves of steel beasts once thought untouchable. The battle was far from over, but already a strange truth had taken root. The Panthers could bleed, and 5 Shermans had proved it. And as the men reloaded, scanning the haze of the next wave, one thought hung over them all. The hour had only just begun. The fog had not yet burned away when the second wave came. Panthers rolled forward in formation, their long 75mm guns pointing like spears into the mist, confident that they would scatter the American resistance with sheer weight of fire. For the Germans, this was not a contest. It was supposed to be an execution. 5 Shermans should have been nothing more than metal coffins waiting for the strike. Yet the field ahead told another story. Burning wrecks where Panthers once stood, crews stunned that such losses could come so quickly. What had been painted as inevitability was unraveling, and the clash that followed would turn disbelief into fury. Sergeant James Holloway steadied himself inside his Sherman, eyes never leaving the sight. He knew the advantage they had gained was fleeting. Surprise was a gift that did not repeat itself. Now the Panthers advanced with caution, turrets twitching, their commanders barking orders sharp with humiliation. Holloway's men could hear it even over the growl of engines, a kind of desperate anger pushing the Germans forward. He muttered to himself, "They're coming to pay us back." Private William Keller shifted uneasily at his post, the periscope trembling slightly beneath his grip. He had seen the first Panther bloom into fire, had felt the rush of triumph, but it had lasted seconds before the weight of reality returned. There were still too many of them. He looked at the shells stacked nearby, their brass gleaming faintly in the dim light, and thought of how few shots separated them from death. A farm boy's hands, once used to guide plows, now rested on the thin armor of Sherman, armor that would not save him from a Panther's shell. Yet he held his ground, because there was no other choice. The lane ahead became a trap, sprung twice over. German tanks bunched, trying to push through the narrow ground, each one vulnerable to the flanking fire Holloway's men could deliver. But with every second, the Panthers adjusted, their guns searching, learning. The first return fire came like thunder. A shell screamed across the hedgerow and struck close, spraying dirt and shrapnel across the Sherman's hull. The crew inside jolted with the impact, ears ringing, lungs filling with the acrid bite of cordite. "Steady," Holloway barked, his voice anchoring them. Another command followed, sharp and measured. The gun thundered again, recoil slamming through the tank. Keller caught the sight. Another Panther hit, its side armor pierced, smoke billowing as its crew scrambled out, their figures faint shadows fleeing from fire. For a moment, he pitied them, men no older than himself, swallowed by machines they had believed invincible. But pity was a luxury that could not last. The Germans answered with fury. One shell found its mark, striking a Sherman at the edge of the hedgerow. The blast ripped through its armor, flames spilling out, the crew's screams lost in the roar. Keller felt his stomach knot as the wreck burned, the number their fragile defense now for. The odds, always impossible, grew worse by the second, yet Holloway did not flinch. "We hold," he said flatly, as though the word itself could bind them to survival. It was in that terrain that old ally turned the tide again. The hedgerows that had hindered men and machine for weeks now shielded the Shermans' positions, masking their angles, breaking the Panthers' line of sight. The Germans had the better guns, the better armor, but the ground betrayed them. Each time they pushed forward, they revealed their flanks, and each time the Shermans pounced. It became a deadly dance, one side pressing with strength, the other striking with precision and desperation. Inside another Sherman, Corporal Davis, a gunner with hands like iron, lined his sight on a Panther cresting the lane. His loader shoved a shell home, sweat dripping into his eyes. "Now!" Davis growled, and the shot flew true. The Panther shuddered, then erupted, its turret blown skyward in a burst of flame. The loader laughed bitterly, the kind of laugh that came not from humor, but from disbelief. "Tin cans, huh?" he muttered, as if mocking the Germans' disdain. The Germans pressed harder, frustration turning to recklessness. Another Panther fired blind to the fog, the shell tearing into an abandoned farmhouse, sending timbers crashing down in a storm of dust. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Panthers might simply bulldoze their way through, smothering the Shermans beneath sheer momentum. But Holloway refused to yield. Each order he gave was calm, precise, delivered with the certainty of a man who knew that hesitation was death. Keller's hands shook as he fed rounds, each casing hot to the touch. He could hear his own heartbeat louder than the thunder outside. When the gun fired again, the recoil slammed through his chest, and he felt alive in a way that was more terror than triumph. Another Panther stopped dead in the lane, smoke trailing skyward like a funeral pyre. He almost smiled before catching himself. These were victories measured in seconds, and each second could be their last. The clash became relentless, a storm of steel and fire, neither side willing to break. And in the midst of it, something shifted. The Panthers, once symbols of certainty, began to hesitate. They paused longer before advancing, wary of hidden guns, uncertain of where the next strike would come. Confidence, once their greatest weapon, faltered. For the first time, German commanders realized that 5 Shermans had held them, bloodied them, forced them to reckon with mortality. Still, the cost was high. Another Sherman took a hit, flames pouring out as its ammunition cooked off. The explosion shook the ground, a brutal reminder that courage did not make armor thicker. The surviving crews gritted their teeth, their determination hardened by the loss of friends. In those burning wrecks, they saw not defeat, but reason to fight harder. The smoke grew so thick that morning seemed swallowed by night. Black columns rose above the hedgerows, flames snapping through the mist, the air alive with the smell of burning steel and scorched earth. Keller's eyes burned, his lungs choked, but he held his post. Somewhere out there, more Panthers waited, engines snarling in the haze. The hour had stretched into something timeless, a crucible where men and machines became bound to destiny. And when the firing slackened, when the Germans pulled back momentarily to regroup, a silence fell heavy and strange. Holloway let out a slow breath, his hand steady on the gun. They had held, for now, but everyone inside that Sherman knew the truth. The battle was far from finished. The Panthers were not done. And the next attack, when it came, would test not only their steel, but their very will to endure. Keller leaned back against the steel wall, sweat dripping into his collar, heart hammering in his chest. The quiet was not peace. It was a pause before another storm. He glanced at the shells still left, counted them in his head, and forced a shaky grin. "Guess we're still in it," he muttered, though no one answered. Outside, the smoke curled upward like black banners, marking the place where certainty had died. The Panthers had come expecting an easy victory, and instead they had met defiance carved in fire. What remained was unfinished, an open wound on the battlefield. And as the mist thinned and daylight began to break, one thing was certain. The clash of steel was only beginning. The morning battle had dragged into its deadliest rhythm, each exchange of fire a coin toss between survival and annihilation. The air was heavy with cordite and smoke, the hedgerows torn apart by shells, and yet the Panthers still pressed forward. They were fewer now, their advance slowed, but their menace had not diminished. For the Americans crouched inside their Shermans, every breath was a gamble, every second a miracle borrowed from death itself. It was here, in this narrowing window of survival, that the turning hour began. Sergeant James Holloway leaned forward over the gunner's shoulder, his eyes sharp, his voice steady. His crew had come to rely on that steadiness. Even when flames licked the sky and shells crashed into the earth around them, Holloway's tone never cracked. He gave orders like a man reciting scripture, each word clear, each phrase measured. Yet inside, beneath the calm, he carried the same fear as his men. He just wore it differently. Command, he knew, was not about being fearless, but about not letting the fear decide for you. Private William Keller could not hide his nerves so easily. His hands shook each time he loaded another round, the metallic clang echoing like a clock ticking down their chances. He remembered Holloway's words before the fight. Hold your ground. They'll show their sides. It had sounded simple, almost easy, but nothing about this fight was easy. He thought of his family farm, of mornings that smelled of hay and dew, and wondered if he would ever see such mornings again. Still, when Holloway's voice rang out, Keller obeyed. Duty kept his fear at bay, if only for seconds at a time. The Panthers pressed again, pushing into the lanes where the hedgerows funneled them like cattle driven to slaughter. Their commanders barked orders, furious and disbelieving that Shermans of all things, would dare and stand against them. One Panther moved too far ahead, its turret hunting for a target. Holloway seized the moment. His Sherman fired, the shell striking the enemy's side. The explosion ripped through the tank, flames shooting skyward. Through his periscope, Keller caught sight of German crewmen scrambling from the wreck, their faces pale and stricken. He felt no triumph, only a cold recognition. It was them, or us. The Germans answered in kind. A shell screamed across the lane and tore into another American Sherman. The blast shook the earth, fire blossoming from its hull. The men inside had no chance, their cries swallowed by the roar of the inferno. Holloway's crew watched in silence, the loss cutting deep. They were down to 3. The balance teetered dangerously close to collapse. Yet something shifted in that moment. The Germans slowed. Each advance became more cautious, each movement edged with hesitation. The invincibility they had carried into Mortain was faltering. They had expected to crush, not to bleed. Now they bled. And with every panther that burned, the myth of their superiority cracked a little more. Holloway sensed it. They're rattled, he said, almost himself. Don't let him breathe. His words galvanized the crew. They were exhausted, battered, their numbers thinning, but they struck again, and another panther faltered. The ground itself seemed to side with them, the hedgerows offering concealment, the narrow lanes choking the enemy's strength. What the Shermans lacked in armor, they made up for in guile. The clash became a test not of machines, but of will. Holloway's calm steadied the crew. Keller's determination fueled their fire, and even the loader, drenched in sweat and grime, found a rhythm that turned chaos into something almost methodical. Each man carried his own terror, his own doubt, yet together they became something formidable. Amid the fire and smoke, a moment of dark humor surfaced. A German shell struck a farmhouse, sending chickens scattering into the haze, their frantic squawks rising above the roar of engines. Keller couldn't help but bark a laugh, the sound startling in its absurdity. Even the hens know who's winning, he said, though the grin vanished as quickly as it came. Humor was a shield, thin but necessary, a reminder that they were still human amid the steel. The turning hour deepened as the Panthers began to withdraw, not in full retreat, but in pause, their confidence shaken. Black smoke curled above the fields, the wrecks of their mighty tanks, marking the cost of their arrogance. For the Americans, it was more than survival. It was vindication. They had proven, if only in this pocket of battle, that the Sherman could stand its ground against the beasts of steel. Yet no one inside Holloway's tank mistook this for victory. They knew the fight was far from over, that more Panthers lurked beyond the haze, regrouping, ready to strike again. Holloway himself allowed no room for triumph. "Stay sharp," he warned. "They'll come again. They always do." His voice was even, but his eyes betrayed the weight he carried, the knowledge that each decision, each command, might decide who lived and who burned. As the smoke settled briefly and silence crept back into the hedgerows, Keller leaned against a steel wall, his breath ragged. He counted the remaining shells with a grim frown. They had enough for a little longer, but not forever. The quiet was deceptive, a lull before the storm. He closed his eyes for a moment, hearing the distant rumble of engines somewhere in the mist. The battle was not done. It had only shifted shape. That morning had begun with certainty. The Germans certain of their victory. The Americans certain of their doom. But as the hour turned, certainty itself had died. In its place stood something harder, stranger. The realization that even giants had stumbled, and even tin cans could fight like lions when cornered. When the Germans moved again, as all knew they would, it would not be a battle of numbers or machines alone. It would be a battle of resolve. The Panthers would come with fire and fury, determined to reclaim their pride. The Shermans would meet them with what little they had left. 3 tanks, dwindling shells, and it was sharpened by survival. And so, as the mist lifted and the sun began to carve through the smoke, the men waited, hearts pounding, hands steadying on steel. The turning hour had passed, but the day's true test still lay ahead. The wreck still burned when the sun finally pierced the fog, the rising light cutting through smoke like a blade. The hedgerows were blackened, the soil torn open, and the air reeked of oil and charred steel. For Sergeant James Holloway and survivors of his crew, the battlefield had become a graveyard where giants lay broken. They had lived through the hour that should have ended them. But the echoes of Mortain were not silence. They were a promise that the storm would come again. Holloway stood half out of his turret. Binoculars pressed to his eyes. The distant rumble of engines was still there, muted but steady. More Panthers were waiting, regrouping beyond the haze. His jaw tightened, his face streaked with soot and sweat. He knew what they had done was extraordinary, but he also knew it had not been enough. Every victory bought them only more time, and time in war was a currency that ran out fast. Inside the Sherman, Private William Keller shifted uncomfortably on the steel bench. His hands were blistered from feeding shells, his shoulders aching from the constant recoil of the gun. He felt older now, though he was still a boy by most measures. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of men he had watched burn in other tanks, their cries swallowed by fire. He wondered if his face would haunt someone else's memory before the day was done. The loader, Davis, broke the silence with a bitter laugh. "They'll write this up as a miracle, you watch. 5 Shermans against Panthers. They'll put it in the papers back home." His tone was edged with exhaustion, the words more weary than proud. Holloway glanced at him and shook his head. "Miracles don't hold the line," he said. "Men do." There was no arrogance in it, only a simple truth. The lull was short-lived. A shell whistled overhead and smashed into the hedgerow behind them, throwing dirt high into the air. The Germans were probing, testing the line again. Holloway ducked back into the turret, his voice sharp and calm all at once. "They're coming!" Eyes front. Engines roared as Panthers pushed forward, this time more cautiously, spreading their advance wider, seeking to flank the Shermans that had bloodied them. Through the periscope, Keller saw their shapes looming, dark, massive, relentless. His stomach twisted, but his hands moved without hesitation, shoving another shell into place. The rhythm of survival had become second nature. The gun roared, the shot slamming into the lead Panther. Sparks flew as the shell ricocheted off its heavy armor, a grim reminder that luck and placement mattered as much as courage. The German tank answered with a blast that shook the ground, earth raining down on the Sherman's hull. Keller flinched but did not falter. Another shell, another chance. This was no longer ambush. It was a slugging match, each side trading fire, each second stretching into eternity. Another American Sherman to their left took a direct hit, erupting in flames, its crew spilling out, some crawling, some still. Holloway clenched his teeth but did not look away. The field was narrowing, and soon it would be just them. He gave the order, and Davis fired again. This time the shot struck true, the Panthers' flank catching fire, its turret grinding to a halt. Keller let out a sharp breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. 2 against many, the odds dwindling with every heartbeat, yet still they stood. The German advance slowed again, the sight of their burning comrades spreading doubt through their ranks. Holloway recognized it immediately. He knew hesitation when he saw it. "They're breaking," he muttered, more to himself than his crew. But even as he said it, he knew the cost. They had bled the Panthers, shaken their certainty, but they could not destroy them all. The weight of numbers would grind them down eventually. Keller stared through the scope, his hands trembling now not from fear, but from exhaustion. He thought of home, of fields untouched by fire, of the quiet rhythm of work without the shadow of death. He wondered if that world still existed for him. Yet he stayed at his post, because the men beside him depended on it, and because retreat was not an option. Another shell screamed overhead, exploding so close that the Sherman rocked on its treads. The crew inside were thrown against steel walls, ears ringing, breath knocked from their lungs. For a moment, Keller thought it was the end, but the tank held. Somehow, impossibly, it held. The Panthers pulled back again, their commanders unwilling to throw more steel into the chokehold of the hedgerows. Smoke rose higher, flames licking at the sky, the ground littered with twisted wreckage. Holloway exhaled slowly, his hands steady on the controls. "They'll come again," he said, "but not today." His voice was even, almost defiant. Silence crept in, broken only by the distant crackle of fire and the moan of wounded men in the fields. Keller leaned his head back, eyes closing, his body trembling with relief and grief all at once. He had survived the turning of the hour. He had stared into the jaws of death and lived. Yet he knew that survival was not victory. It was only a reprieve. The echoes of Mortain carried far beyond the hedgerows. The Germans had believed their Panthers would roll through the American line without resistance. Instead, they had been stopped, not by superior machines, but by 5 Shermans and the men inside them. It was a lesson carved into steel and fire, that resolve could outmatch certainty, that courage could humble pride. As the sun climbed higher, Holloway climbed out of the turret, his silhouette sharp against the smoke. He looked over the battlefield, at the burning hulks of Panthers, at the graves of his own men marked by fire and twisted metal. His face was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something hard and unyielding. "We held," he said quietly, as though speaking to the dead. "And that's enough." For now it was... Tomorrow would bring more battles, more blood, more echoes of war. But on that morning, in the fields of Mortain, a handful of Shermans had stood against the might of Germany and left the enemy shocked, humbled, and reeling. The line had held, and history had shifted, if only by inches. And sometimes, in war, inches were everything.